talk about Galerius?
Yes. I consider him a good emperor. I think on wars alone he pushes ahead. His military credentials ensure for me that he isn't mediocre personally because he does win. His Persian War is the arguably the pinnacle of Rome's successes against the Sasanians prior to, the final big war between Heraclius and Khosrow II.
Mm.
It allows Diocletian to impose the Treaty of Nisibis, which basically forces the Sasanians to give up influence over Armenia and Georgia, Iberia, Lazica, Caucasian Albania, modern Azerbaijan. They have to give up 7 trans-Tigritanian satrapies to either the Romans or to vassalized Armenia. It's not clear. So Galerius's victory enables this powerful sort of strategic buffering of the eastern frontier in the Caucasus and in Upper Mesopotamia in quite a major way. And he achieves it through sheer boldness. He was just such a bold general, which I guess I respect. I mean, it's risky, but
you have to be risky in war.
Yeah, and I mean, so when Narse first invades Upper Mesopotamia, and he clearly takes the Romans by surprise because they have a much smaller army there when suddenly he shows up. And he's sort of trying to relive the glory days of his father, Shapur. He invades, and Bill Ledbetter's analysis of this campaign is quite fascinating because it's often dismissed as a defeat, and but it's more nuanced than that because Galerius does suffer some pretty nasty Christian propaganda that does seem to seep into other sources. And the thing is, so Bill Ledbetter's analysis shows that what actually looks like happened was, so Galerius was there with a much smaller army, and he fought a series of holding actions in Upper Mesopotamia that managed to keep Narse back and prevent him from doing what Shapur would have done, which is then enter Syria, sack Antioch, do all the nasty classic, Sassanid classic mode campaigns that would have happened back in the 260s.
Yeah.
And he does get the worst of it apparently in the third encounter. So Orosius specifies there were 3 encounters and that he got the worst of it in the third one. And that produced that whole story about Diocletian making Galerius run before his...
He was defeated at Carrhae, wasn't he?
Yeah, it was somewhere between Carrhae and Callinicum that these actions were happening. And it's clearly a risky area because that's also where Crassus had been defeated, and it's the sort of area where Valerian had been defeated between Carrhae and Edessa. But it looks like Galerius, with a smaller army, with inferior cavalry, fought this brave holding action in the open plains where Crassus and Valerian had been defeated, and did get battered in the third encounter and had to withdraw, but ultimately succeeded in blunting the attack of the Persians. And I think that's something that kind of gets obscured. It does get obscured by the sources and this, strange story about running before the carriage, because I don't believe that for one moment. I think in a world where succession was clearly so volatile, I think it would have been insane for Diocletian to humiliate his Caesar like that. So I personally don't buy that. And I think, and all the sources that mention that, it's all the same tradition. It's all stemming from the Kaisergeschichte. Even Lactantius doesn't mention it, and Lactantius sort of presents Galerius as this brooding, power-hungry figure, and yet he doesn't mention this carriage story. And yet it would make sense to mention it, I think. Then he has to reinforce the army while Diocletian fights the usurpation in Egypt. And then in the middle of winter, marching through the mountains of Armenia, he springs his army upon the Persian camp while they're not suspecting it. And there's even a story about how he personally reconnoitered the camp. There's different versions. There's an Armenian tradition that claims that he literally entered the camp as a cabbage seller.
Yeah.
There's the Latin version, which has him and a couple of other horsemen getting a good look in and then going back to the camp. There's a third version, a Greek version, which has him enter in the guise of an ambassador. And whether we believe it or not, it's interesting that 3 different historical traditions with little possibility of interdependence give some version of this story.
Yeah.
But certainly in the 3rd century, emperors were getting more and more into this well, to prove my military legitimacy, I do have to get kind of a bit into the thick of it a bit more, like Maximinus fought in the. Yeah, Maximinus, we know, as we mentioned, fought in battles personally in the actual fighting, and Gallienus challenged Postumus to one-on-one combat. And so maybe Galerius was, as a career officer turned emperor, understanding the importance of military respect, did what Marcellus, for example, did back in the Second Punic War, which is personally go on the scouting mission, in this case, in the middle of winter in the mountains of Armenia, and then pulled off this grand attack that basically wiped out the Persian army, captured the royal family, captured the Queen of Queens, Arsane, captured sisters, daughters, and other wives of the King of Kings. The King of Kings is wounded and has to flee.
It was a complete disaster for Narses.
Yeah, at least 13 war elephants are captured, according to one source. And then he invades Persia. He just follows up. He chases him. We know from his victory titles that he entered Media or Tropatini. He entered Adiabene. He besieged, one source tells us that he besieged Gunda Shahpur in Lower Mesopotamia. He entered the vicinity of Ctesiphon. We're not told he took Ctesiphon, but he certainly went past it. And then eventually attacked Nisibis, the very important Upper Mesopotamian fortress, from the southeast. Like, he attacked this fortress from the Persian side and took it, and then basically waited there for the peace envoys at that point. But it's an out there and interesting and pretty successful campaign. We don't have many details, but over multiple years, he defeated the Carpi and resettled them in Roman territory. He also fought a major war against the Sarmatians that also lasted multiple years. The victory titles all attest to this. Each year he was taking Sarmaticus and Carpicus.
I know Jordanes mentions how the Tetrarchs campaigned against, well, he terms them the Goths, but they are Sarmatians, leading these punitive attacks like Aurelian did. And their campaigns are very effective in removing them as threats long term, like the Goths, where they may be in this case, don't show up again until Alaric and that lot.
Well, the Carpi become effectively extinct as a people.
The last of them are settled on Roman territory, and that's the end of them. They disappear.
Yeah, they stop being mentioned. They've basically been resettled. The Carpi and the Vistani are both resettled, in the Balkans, and that basically entails the extinction of their people. And you can see in the victory titles, I think it's between 301 and 305, he's consistently taking the title Carpicus every year. Yeah. And then between 305 and 308, he's taking Sarmaticus. So the sources don't go into many details, but he's clearly very busy on the Danube frontier. I'll just quickly add his early war. When he first became Caesar, he actually marched into Egypt to put down a revolt in the Thebaid in Upper Egypt. Yeah. Again, which was threatening, as we mentioned earlier with Probus, it would have been threatening the Red Sea trade and the mines in the east and the food supply. And in doing so, he also actually fought the Nubians and the Blemmyes, who were the people of the Eastern Desert, who had an organized confederation by now. They had actually formed a proper state by this point in time, and he managed to defeat them. So, yeah, he was very militarily successful.
I actually think it's Diocletian who establishes the forts along the Danube again. I think when they switched, Galerius takes over the overseeing operation of establishing the new defensive lines along the Danube, because one of Diocletian's new military strategies is, people call it defense in depth. He's building stone forts rather than just wooden border castles, and they're permanent defensive lines, which eventually under Constantine get garrisoned by the Limitani and so on. But in this period, it's just regular field forces.
Yeah, archaeology does show that Galerius and Diocletian were both building on the eastern frontier and the Danube frontier a lot of forts, smaller, more defensible stone fortresses all along the borders, and also inland as well, and also in some cases in the Danube beyond as well. You're seeing them in Sarmatia itself as a sort of forward defense / policing fortresses.
Also, it shows the end of the elastic defensive policy of the 3rd century emperors. I was saying with Gallienus that the strategy had moved to try and stop them on the frontiers to being one of taking them out after they've entered Roman territory, back to being fending them off on the frontiers.
Sure, although it's also a sort of a bit of both, I suppose, because the fact that you have these fortresses deeper within the interior as well shows that even if they do get through, they haven't exactly broken the seal. There's still, these fortresses deeper in. And we also know that each tetrarch does seem to have a comitatus imperial field army attached. David Potter actually does argue that the comitatenses, he thinks they first came into being actually under Diocletian. It comes down to the legal evidence that suggests that in 325, when Constantine started legislating on whether the comitatenses, what the retirement benefits of the comitatenses and the limitanae would be, he's doing it for both Licinius's forces and his own, the former forces of Licinius by then, but only a year after he had defeated Licinius. And so Potter argues either, therefore, Constantine and Licinius had together instituted the system of comitatenses and limitanae, or if we have trouble believing that because Licinius and Constantine didn't have great relations with one another, then actually maybe it was a tetrarchic thing. And then what Constantine did was solidify that arrangement with, for example, the Magistri Militum, and the sort of, solidifying the structure around what it meant to have comitatenses and what it meant to have limitanae. That's a whole debate, but certainly Galerius and Diocletian were instituting very important defensive reforms on the Danube and in the east. And we know that Diocletian, incidentally, also withdrew the southern frontier in Egypt. He ceded the Dodecus Koinos, just beyond the First Cataract, to the Nubians and set them up as a buffer state against the Blemmyes. And he also gave them both a stipend, both peoples. But I suppose, and Galerius, he was also an anti-corruption emperor. We've got edicts of his against the overly rapacious tax collectors and debt collectors. The Caesariani, in particular, who were these imperial agents.
Yes, the secret impotents, yeah.
And we know Diocletian also, Aurelius Victor mentions that Diocletian had done similar edicts against them to try and curb their power a bit. But it's sort of ironic, I suppose, that Galerius has this, reputation for effort to curb corrupt debt collectors and tax collectors when, in fact, it does appear to have been his tax policy that caused Maxentius to usurp.
Yes.
Well, that allowed Maxentius to usurp.
That is one of the complaints that Lactantius points it out. At least one of the people that does that. One of the reasons why there's so much support is because of the imposition of taxes. It might also be to do with the fact that Rome, which hadn't been taxed before, now has to pay taxes, which Hadrian tried to do back in the 2nd century and then had to repeal his idea because he had faced so much opposition because of it.
Rome hadn't paid a poll tax since, a tax per head of, number of people in a household. They hadn't paid that since the late Republic, clearly intending to extend Diocletian's increasingly extensively structured taxation program, wanted to bring Rome into the picture and wanted to bring Italy into the picture and make them pull their weight.
Yeah.
And Rome was having none of it. And so, unfortunately for them, Maxentius was present in Rome at the time. And the Senate and the discontented people and the Praetorians who, Diocletian, as you mentioned, was already whittling down the size of the Praetorian Guard.
Yeah.
And Galerius intended to end it altogether. And the Praetorians knew this. And so you had all these discontented elements within Rome alongside a prince who had not been allowed to become emperor.
Yeah, and they all joined together.
Yeah, I'd actually say that's probably one of the biggest blunders of the Tetrarchic period is allowing Maxentius to actually live in Rome, because he surely wasn't just living there without their permission. They wouldn't just let a prince. I think it seems that they wanted him to be some kind of, like unofficial representative. He's the son of an emperor. He's also the husband. He's the son-in-law of Galerius, the son of Maximian. So he represents both East and West. This is another Bill Ledbetter argument. He's a member of the senatorial class, and so he's there to kind of represent imperial interests, but in a way that the tetrarchs themselves, Maximian doesn't have to go there himself, because that would sort of, Olivier Hexter argues that would sort of throw out the ideological balance to have a single tetrarch in Rome itself.
Yeah.
And yet it's quite the blunder, because Maxentius was clearly not just some pushover. He wasn't going to let it stand that he wasn't succeeding to the throne. And that's partly Diocletian's problem, but then Galerius makes it worse by trying to tax these people, and he also sets up Severus as the emperor in Italy, and prosopographical studies show that Severus was essentially taking control with a bunch of Balkan officials in an environment where Italians had been king. Maximian had used Italians as many of his officials were Italians. He was playing to the local base. And then Galerius puts poor Severus into this position of ruling Italy with all these Balkan loyalists. So you could certainly say that Galerius mishandled Italy in a way that almost guaranteed the collapse of the Imperial College. And certainly it is unambiguously the case that Galerius failed to hold the Imperial College together. He made some attempts by trying to get Diocletian to bring things together at the Conference of Carnuntum. He even invited Diocletian to retake power, which Maximian did as well in attempting to get him on his side. Yeah. And so I guess it's difficult. Galerius sort of fails once he's an Augustus.
He is a good follower, but when he's in charge, although he's not a complete know-nothing when it comes to running the empire, and he does take on the kind of father-eight figure that Diocletian had once been. To his credit, and also to the Tetrarchy's credit as a effective system, is that you have all of the instability from 306 to 308, but then you have this extraordinary event where the rivals of various factions come together to sort out what they're going to do, and then they actually abide by it for the next 3 years until Galerius dies. So Constantine is recognized as an emperor. Magnentius gets a bit short shrift, but
yes,
Maximian is persuaded to step down. Diocletian returns home, and everything seems to be fine. Galerius stays in power. Maximinus are lessened, but that's because there aren't any problems in the East.
The Carnuntum settlement is interesting because it also shows that Galerius was flexible when he needed to be, because, he sets up Licinius as the Augustus in the West, and Licinius is tasked with bringing an end to Maxentius. He's clearly not going to allow Maxentius any leeway, but I think in his mind, probably Maxentius, to give in to Maxentius at this point it'd be a political disaster to do that. Constantine could claim, well, my father made me the successor and the soldiers want me. And I guess Galerius, we know that he handled that fairly well, because he accepted it, but he also made clear, okay, but you're Caesar and Severus will be the Augustus in the West. And Constantine accepted that. And then after Carnuntum, Constantine refused to accept being demoted to Caesar, because Maximian had already promoted him to Augustus as part of their alliance. And so he wasn't willing to be demoted back to Caesar, which is what Galerius wanted to do. And eventually in 310, Galerius, again showing, some flexibility, recognized, well, let's just silently start acknowledging Constantine as Augustus. And let's also do the same with Maximinus, because Maximinus himself was not happy that Licinius had been made Augustus ahead of him when Licinius hadn't even been a Caesar.
Yeah, and he's Augustus in 310.
Yeah, and ultimately Galerius acknowledges that.
Yeah.
He can't embitter the only other ally he has other than Licinius. Making Licinius Augustus ahead of Maximinus is a bit of a controversial move, but
Perhaps Flight is being overly affected by hindsight, but you can see the Tetrarchy that Diocletian set up no longer working, and circumstances have changed. And so Galerius is pragmatically trying to make it work without leading to a civil war. And I think
Yeah,
successful. Okay, now there are
yeah.
4 Augusti and 2 people proclaiming themselves emperor that shouldn't be. Alexander and
Mm.
Mag- keep saying Magnentius, Maxentius in Italy. But on the whole, you've got 4 emperors, which they're all Augusti now, but they are running their parts of the empire. They're not attacking anyone. For the rest of Galerius's life, for the next 3 years, they pretty much stay in that position.
Well, yeah, and also the very last thing he does is a show of political pragmatism, which is the Edict of Toleration towards the Christians. Despite being apparently a pretty zealous persecutor himself, who supposedly is the one who persuaded Diocletian into the Great Persecution, he eventually does seem to realize. I mean, perhaps this is because by then he was literally decaying, because he had that horrible disease that saw his genitals sort of rot and his bowels decaying. And supposedly it was, and in that context, that's when he issued the Edict of Toleration. So maybe he genuinely thought, okay, that there's a God out there. It's not necessarily what the Christian God is. Well, I mean, the pagans believed in other people's gods. They just didn't think they were the only gods generally.
Yeah.
But presumably in his mind, okay, this God is angry with me and this persecution hasn't achieved anything. let's end it.
Or at least in the historical record, it's framed as he issues this Edict of Toleration and then asks the Christians to pray to their God for him. So it's
Yes.
kind of wish me luck, lads, in the next life kind of thing.
Like he understood it was better to have the Christians praying to their God for the emperor rather than not praying at all and being in hiding.
Yeah.
He also, incidentally, is the first tetrarch until eventually Constantine to return imperial women to a position of prominence. He makes his wife Galeria Valeria, who was the daughter of Diocletian, so she was a prestigious figure, makes her into an Augusta, and coins all throughout the eastern half of the empire honor her as Augusta. And he actually also deifies his mother, Romula. And there's even a story that he claimed that Romula had had a visit from Mars, and that's why he was who he was. He basically used an Alexander myth, supposedly, to strengthen his own legitimacy.
I suppose it's also copying Diocletian a little bit, Viani and Herculani.
Yeah, it is. It's taking it a little further, but it is certainly in the same ballpark, that sort of divine emperorship. Appointing Licinius is a bit of a controversial move because he hadn't been Caesar, but then again, I suppose he didn't think he could just move Maximinus from the east. Licinius was an emperor without territory, really.
Yeah.
Until Maxentius was going to be defeated, he didn't really have his own lands. And so it's a sort of
Illyricum.
Yeah, I guess he would have had Pannonia. Yeah, Illyricum, Pannonia. But it's sort of kind of falling within the Balkan realm of Galerius in a way. He's not that separated from Galerius.
Yeah.
Who was to become the new Augustus in the West must have been a difficult choice. And he clearly couldn't pick Constantine because Constantine had sided with Maximian. And so.
Not politic to assign someone who had just proclaimed themselves emperor rather than being appointed.
Constantine occupies a space between. It's okay to allow him to continue to be emperor, but it's another thing to reward him.
It's a little bit like Valentinian II later in the 4th century, where it's like he is legitimate in pretty much every respect, except how he became emperor is a bit dodgy.
But I guess overall, I consider him a good emperor. I think he clearly had a tough job ahead of him once he succeeded Constantius as senior ranking emperor. But he had a tough job and he made mistakes. But he was pragmatic. And I think for me, his military achievements are such that I have to ultimately go with good.
I would agree. I think he is good. He's militarily very successful, and he does seem to be a canny administrator as well. Although he does make some political errors, and is also responsible for the Christian persecution. He is also good at, as you say, be flexible, be willing to compromise for the good of the empire or for himself, but he is willing to change his policies to meet the reality rather than what he would like to happen. And I think it is to his credit that he is able to make the Tetrarchy last until his death, and so he is in some respects a spiritual successor to Diocletian. And it's only after he dies that it starts to break apart again, now that all of the original Tetrarchs are dead. So that is the Tetrarchy. In our last chat, we'll be talking about the second Tetrarchy, so Severus, Maximinus, the usurper Alexander, Maxentius, Licinius, and Constantine as Tetrarch. And I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Byron, for coming on again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure. And I thank you everyone for watching. And this has been Eastern Roman History.